Hey, Ben, doing great. I'm excited to be here. How
I
are
think
you?
we are now officially live and broadcasting to the world.
The world.
Happy Wednesday, Josh. How's things treating you?
It's a good Wednesday. Things have been busy. I feel like it's great. Like you and I just got to spend some time together last week. We only see each other a few times a year in real life. So, just
Always treasured moments. Well, hello and formally welcome to everyone. I'm Ben Story. I'm the CEO of Avius. Been in and around the attractions and feedback business for coming on 2 decades now. I'm joined today by Josh Liebman, who's one time zone to the left of me up in Chicago. Josh, do you want to give the audience a little bit of a hello in case they don't realize who you are?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Josh. I've also been in the industry coming up on 20 years. Next Tuesday, I will officially be able to say I've been in this business for 20 years. So I'm excited to say I've been in the industry for now more than 20 years, but I keep saying like almost there, right? Just a few days away at this point. My focus is in guest experience, specifically in guest experience strategy. So I help attractions of all scopes and sizes really take guests from being that first-time visitor to that lifelong loyal advocate and really help put together kind of that blueprint and that full strategy of get from one step to the next. And guest feedback is a huge portion of it and is a big passion of mine. And always enjoy when you and I get to riff on the topic.
I was going to say, against my marketing manager's advice, we didn't rehearse this. We've gone through a little bit of a structure. So we're really talking about the psychology around guest feedback. So I'm hoping that the audience will get a chance to take away at least a few nuggets of information. The nice thing is Josh and I are both going to be able to pull on our real life experience, our real stats. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone else is obviously in listen only mode. There is a live comments channel that is being monitored by our team. So feel free to put any comments and questions in there.
Or feedback.
There you go. We'll attempt to address it in real time. However, if we do run out of time, and we will be very respectful of everyone's time today, we'll make sure that between Josh and I, we do reply to everyone if there are any questions there. And look, it even pops up with people saying hello. Look at that.
I just can't get away from Matt Heller. So thanks, Matt, for being here. Good to see you.
At least he introduced himself as himself this week.
That's true.
So yeah, we've got sort of 4 or 5 pillars of slides that we're going to step through, touching on different elements. In our usual Ben and Josh style, we're going to freestyle a little bit. And I'm sure we won't stick completely on topic. But if you're ready to go, Josh, I'm happy to crack into slide 1 and take it from the top.
Let's do it. Let's jump in.
Beautiful. So while we're just waiting for the slides, so the first piece that we want to be talking about is really the impact of the peak end rule. So for those that can see the slide here, it's how someone's judging and basing their experience of their day and their overall rating from various peaks and troughs they're having throughout the day. So yeah, Josh, I say you've seen this both from the survey data, from your backgrounds in mystery shops, etc. In terms of sort of, what's your initial sort of knee jerk to what I'm showing here on the screen?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a saying that we hear often in the industry, whether you're in themed amusement parks, zoos, museums, really anything kind of in attractions, tourism, and hospitality is we strive to create memories that last a lifetime, or we strive to create memorable experiences, right? It's a warm and fuzzy statement, but it's also quite literal. And what this shows right here is where our memories are being formed are the most, I can say the most intense emotional moments of the experience. It doesn't need to be, intense kind of in like physical intensity, but even the most impactful moments, as well as kind of the final ending of the experience. So one of the things I think of is, why do Disney parks have fireworks shows at the end of the day? On one hand, increasing dwell time and gets people to stay longer and they spend more money. But on the other hand, if you see that fireworks show at the end of the day, whatever happened during the day, if there were any friction points, those tend to kind of get swept away a little bit because you've got this final emotionally intense moment with your family, with your friends, the group that you're with, to be able to kind of send you off from the experience, where most experiences end pretty unceremoniously. You're just simply exiting, and that's the final component of it. Now, if you don't have the budget to put on a fireworks show at the end of every single day, as most venues, most businesses do not, there are a lot of smaller but intangible components to it. Even at Universal, which is a very similar caliber to Disney, they do nighttime spectaculars. We'll have a lot of team members from every single attraction. at the exit turnstile of every single day, waving goodbye to guests, of just saying, this is your final send-off right here. So focusing on those peaks of intentionally creating experiences that go beyond expectation, that are going to anchor a memory, and then being very intentional about the final component of the experience has a huge, it gives you a huge opportunity to be able to control the overall satisfaction from the day or from the visit that they're having.
No, I absolutely agree. And I wouldn't want to be pessimistic, but I've seen in my experience where the flip side of that's been the final touch point. I remember when I was younger going to theme parks and paying for parking was a relatively new concept. And some of the attractions that I was visiting, that was your last experience. That was your last touch point. Even, with our airport audience we've got on today, for some people, that's often the last experience you have of leaving an airport journey. You could have gone through a fantastic flight experience. You could have got your baggage on time. It may not even be damaged. But then the final thing was, I've got to pay at the barrier for exit. Now, airports are a little bit more restricted, but theme parks, you typically know how long they're going to be there for. So it's nice to see how that's evolved through that. You're that, talking about that, the peak end rule again of making sure that their last experience isn't a monetary one where I've got to shelve out for one more expenditure.
There's I think Seinfeld has a bit on this, and he uses restaurants as an example. You get your bill at the end of the meal. You can have a fantastic, spectacular experience in the restaurant, and then at the end, you're like, I don't want to do this. Oh, man. And you kind of end up having some regret. That's just what that reminded me of. You paying for parking at the end.
It was good, but...
Yeah. But okay, here's this final moment that's less exciting than the rest of the experience that I had.
Yeah, and re-emphasizing what you're saying, not everyone's got the budget to lay on these massive spectaculars, but it doesn't cost a lot. And I've seen it myself where they've had operationally challenging days and they just bring out extra street performers, or as you say, having extra staff there just to put a face to it. That to me is a huge sort of wow opportunity to be able to sort of recover, to be able to normalize. And I guess that's where, linking back to the difference between, and I know you recently did a session on this, collecting feedback throughout the experience rather than just getting a one-time score as you've literally left the gates, as you're getting a survey the next day. And there's, with the audience we've got today, there's various different methodologies and there's no perfect golden bullet to an absolute wrong or right answer. But I think the biggest thing as we're evolving is these attractions we're working with, they are listening, they are evolving, they are changing.
And I think collecting feedback throughout the experience in general gives you the opportunity to actually collect the data to say, well, where are our peaks? Where are the peak emotional moments throughout the day where now if we see they're happening at certain times of the day with certain locations within the venue, we can allocate some resources in that direction to say, okay, we really want to make sure that we're creating that core memory. You talk about, the streetmosphere, the street characters being dispatched to areas of high congestion. You can anticipate that, to a certain degree, and you can also now measure the effectiveness of it as well, whether it's justifying the labor or being able to say, okay, we can really operationalize something as intangible as satisfaction.
It is. It's almost like, what's the secret sauce? If something's working in one part of the attraction, then what are we doing differently? It may be out of your control, but it may be something that you can almost copy and paste. And it may be down to a few key members of staff and, what are they doing differently and how do we, copy and paste and I guess encourage them to spread that good message and good cheer across the rest of the experience. Yeah.
And I think a lot of it, just has to do with intentionality of you're creating these experiences on purpose. I like to say that great service or great experiences doesn't happen by chance. And if you tie in this concept of peak end rule of saying, okay, we know that not every moment is going to be a peak. And frankly, it shouldn't be. That would be exhausting, physically, mentally, whatever it is. But say, okay, we can identify certain components throughout the duration where a guest is visiting the venue where we're going to drive it a little bit harder. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to do that on purpose, whether it's structurally in the SOP with the way that guests are, or that staff are interacting with guests, or if it is certain components or elevated parts of the experience, we say, hey, we know we can create an anchor moment, an anchor memory that taps into the peak end rule that leads to, at the end of the day, them saying, wow. And then on the car ride home, what was your favorite part of the experience? They're talking about those peaks.
I guess the final bit before we move on from this slide is also, we've all been to park, we've all had negative experience, be it from the course of our own actions, the group we're with, or, say something from the actual, anything from the weather to, ride availability. It's how they recover from that as well. And we've talked about this many times on stage in terms of if you actually have a guest challenged, that you recover correctly. And that correction doesn't need to be a monetary compensation. It can just be listening. It can be, hey, I'm so sorry, the ride's closed because of this, and it will be opening when lightning's outside of this range, or whatever it is. That's a golden opportunity to be able to turn people into ambassadors and turn a negative into that positive.
Yep.
So it's one of those not to be afraid of the negative.
Yeah, and there's data that supports that. It's called the recovery paradox, and it shows exactly.
Find out more information about that.
Yeah, exactly. When you effectively recover from service failures, you're not just canceling out the troughs that you see on the chart. You're creating the peaks. They become more memorable. Even if the guest is talking about, hey, the service failure happened, this happened, then they'll say, but then Ben jumped into action. He took us behind the scenes. He was able to, help us make back some of the time that we lost. And it was an amazing experience overall. We wouldn't have had otherwise if the service failure never would have occurred.
No, totally. So I want to keep momentum going on this. So the next slide we're about to bring up is all around expectation setting. So how does the parallel line up? So just to give a little bit of narrative, and the slide's going to stay up for this whole sort of next 10 minutes. But essentially, we've got data that we've taken from last year's feedback that we've collected, looking at how people's expectations related to their core 3 satisfaction drivers. So your middle column in the chart that I'm showing is here, showing that 51% of the respondents that we surveyed rated their experience as better than expected, 37.5 same as expected, and then 11.5 worse than expected. And as we know, and we're going to dive into this a little bit now, there's various factors that will contribute to these different elements, etc. But the key thing that we want to really be talking about here is, the importance of the pre-visit. So the experience from, I've just decided we are going to go to this park. Well, my first experience is going on the website. It's buying tickets. It's what's the messaging. It's what's the hype and the build up. So when I'm walking in that door, that initial sort of expectation, sort of what's that been, and how my expectations align against the core KPIs here. For those that don't know, NPS is a 0 to 10 recommendation score. Satisfaction and customer service for this sample set we're using is based on a 5-point scale, where we're looking at the percentage of the top box, so the very satisfied and the excellent customer service.
Yeah. And then and I've learned this from you, any NPS score above 0 is considered to be good news. And especially when we see it over here, better than expected, leading to almost 77 score. That's massive. That's not 77%. Yeah. That's not a C, right? Like that is a huge number, right?
That's important to mention, that the NPS scale can actually go from -100 to +100. You can Google it very quickly to see how NPS is calculated. But it's something that's very interesting to see how expectations, and to pull on one of my recent experiences, and I'm going to name check them, and I know they're in the audience today. Epic Universe, the latest and greatest, newest theme park that's just opened on my doorstep. My expectations for that day one were obviously very, very high, because the excitement, the marketing, the build behind it. And I'm pleased to say, and I promise I'm not being paid for this, it exceeded those expectations. It was surprise and delight around every corner. It was excitement. It was a thoroughly good day. Whereas I've also had flip side of experiences where I've gone and done other either journeys or experiences where I've not necessarily gone into it as excited or as hyped up, and then been blown away by how phenomenal it was. Mm-hmm. So I guess the bit I'd love to share with the audience, Josh, is how do we help shape that experience, everything from the pre-journey to that early onset, and how it sits with their expectations.
Yeah, you touched on a couple important things here. It can be really challenging to set expectations in the attractions industry. We've all probably heard the phrase under promise and over deliver. And if you're in marketing in particular, you probably don't align with that phrase, right? Like that, we cannot simply do that. If we under promise, we're not going to get the business. So we need to really balance the fact that we say the expectation needs to be very specific and very intentional, that it wins the business. So it needs to be a high expectation, especially in the attractions industry where people don't need to visit and the competition is literally limitless. We need to say this experience is going to be better than any other alternative option that you could do at this time. With that said, we now need to set up the operations folks to be able to deliver on that promise and exceed that expectation. So the experience that you had at Epic Universe, you've had 7 years to form an expectation on it, right? And it probably only went up and up and up. And then getting put to the test of like, okay, is this, when the rubber hits the road, like, is this actually going to be everything I've hoped and dreamed and planned for, and watched the videos on YouTube and looked at the website and talked to people and all, and driven by and watched the construction and all that. And he said, yeah, not only did it meet, meeting your expectations is challenging enough. The fact that you said it went beyond it as well shows how compelling that experience truly was. You also mentioned experiences that you've had where you've had a very low expectation, and maybe you had to go, maybe somebody, kind of dragged you along the way, or it was kind of a full discretion, kind of a throwaway idea, like, all right, I'm just gonna go do this, and that you were blown away by it. Well, I call that the DMV effect. If you've, for those particularly in the United States, if the DMV is kind of joked about a lot as being like sort of the epitome of a poor experience, which therefore gives them a better chance to be able to exceed your expectation. If there are no like flickering light bulbs, and like if they've got, a coffee pot, and like the chairs have maybe a cushion on them and aren't like the most uncomfortable thing to sit in, and maybe if they've got Wi-Fi, and the employee at the DMV, if they make eye contact and are just mildly friendly, you're like, whoa, like that really went far above and beyond my expectation, because that expectation was so low. In attractions, in leisure, in hospitality, in tourism, we don't have that. We've got people coming in with such a high expectation that we need to not only meet, but very intentionally exceed that expectation as well. So I think this actually ties really nicely with the last slide of the peak end rule of how do we make sure that this chart really can come to life of the better than expected, and then seeing that high NPS, that high satisfaction, and that high perception of customer service are through leveraging things like the peak end rule and the recovery paradox that we talked about a few minutes ago.
I think that's really, and to keystone onto that in terms of the expectations people will have. So, you're based in Chicago. When you're traveling for business on your own, you have a very different expectation of your journey through the airport than when you travel through with the family. Yeah. And it may just be, I know that, the family haven't all got pre-check, for example. So I know I'm going to have to go through the rigmarole of going through security, etc. And it's how that expectation setting isn't necessarily a fair reflection always. And again, to call them out again, Epic Universe for their grand opening, everything on the rumor mills on social media was it's going to be a horrific day. It's going to be so busy. It's going to be so slammed. But they were very clever with the way that they adjusted based on their preview days, both the operational procedures and laying on extra cars and knowing when it's going to be peaks and troughs, but also by being very sensible with limiting the number of tickets. So everyone that came in had a fantastic experience. I was actually one of those, full disclosure, I had tickets for opening day, and I deliberately sacrificed them and moved them to a preview day, thinking that I'd have a better experience. Now, granted, I still had a fun day, but I obviously missed out on all the fun of the hype of being at a grand opening of a park, because honestly, I was like, I don't want to stand in lines for an hour.
Yeah. 15 years ago today, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter opened the first time. And I was there. I was on the guest services team. I know Matt Heller's in the audience. He was there. He was directing, crowd control in the land. And I think that was one of the most significant openings that Universal has had. And I think that they did a great job of using guest feedback that every opening that they've had after that, whether a new attraction, a new land, or in this case, a new park, of saying, hey, we can continually improve upon the experience for our guests. And I heard the same thing about grand opening. I mean, I was expecting I-4 to be a gridlock and that nobody would be able to get in, and people are getting hot and there's no water, and, are people getting, heat sensitive. And I mean, I'm sure that probably happened to an extent, but, I didn't hear like you said, the horror stories that you were expecting to hear from it.
Yeah, I had a little bit of FOMO, I put it that way.
Yeah.
The final little nugget, and I want to keep sharing real bits of information. So, as you know, we've been working with Atlanta Airport since 2018, and a lot of the audience here would have traveled through the airport, but they've got over 105 restaurants now, where we've got one of our little tablets at the exit for guests to very simply click on a happy face and walk away if they want, or if they click on a sad face, it then interrogates to find out why. Now, the driver behind all of this for the airport, for Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, was around, ultimately, there's a very similar parallel between an airport and attraction, that they want to increase satisfaction. That then increased to longer dwell time and ultimately to secondary spend. At the end of the day, the airport is primarily there for transportation. But if you look at them now, there's shops, there's massages, there's mini hotels, there's pet relief, there's everything that you've got going on. So it's a very similar overlap. So in our work we've had since 2018, I pulled some stats this morning, Josh, some fresh stats, that we've had 19 million passengers leave feedback just on those little tablets, which is a phenomenal, but it equates to around about 9 to 11,000 surveys a day. But crucially for the airport, this expectation piece, and they don't advertise it overtly, but it's kind of in the essence, the restroom score itself has moved 10% over that period of time, which it may not sound like a huge impact, but to move and be able to shift that dial, that's not just by throwing money and refurbing the restrooms, it's down to the staff attitude. I remember when we first put the devices in, the staff were parking the cleaning carts in front of the machines sometimes because they didn't want to be rated. Whereas now, if the machine's down, they want to be able to have that ability for the passengers to go and leave their feedback. And if you go into some of the concourses, you'll have the custodians interacting and making conversations. Hi, how are you? And being very theme park-esque in an environment that typically an airport was purely there as a process of I have to get on my plane. To have something along that journey, it's just an interesting spin, and they can now start tracking how that's impacting onto the rest of their KPIs they collect across the airport. So it's
cool.
It's also scary to realize we've had that many
expectations too of, if I fly into ATL, I'm anticipating it's going to be a little bit of stress. I anticipate I'm going to have a 35-minute layover and I have to get from terminal A to terminal E, and I'm gauging, am I going to run faster than the tram or not? If I have a restroom employee who's interacting with me in an efficient way, who actually, cares about, the experience of the passenger, that goes a long way.
No, totally agree. Right, I want to keep this train rolling, excuse the pun. So we're now going to be moving on to a piece, and again, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what this is focusing on. So we're looking at some data here of how impactful that first impression is. We've already touched on it to some extent, so we're going to drill a little bit deeper. But what I'm showing you here is the first impression score, and this is based from mystery shop data, and how that first impression from excellent through to very poor, the distribution of that in the middle column, but then on the right-hand side, the average score rating that they've left at the end of their experience. So the maximum score you can get here is a 5.0. And it's really crucial to show that someone that's come in and had a either poor or very poor experience is struggling to get above 60% overall satisfaction with a 3.2 and a 2.5 respectively. And how important that initial first impression is, and how important it is to try and recover that if there are challenges which do happen in day-to-day work, day-to-day life.
It sounds cliche, but you really don't get a second chance at making a first impression. And I've done a lot of work with mystery shops as well, and I've seen pretty consistent data as well. Even if you kind of drill down into the specifics and the interactions they're having, with the team member that might be at admissions, for instance, of being the first point of contact. If that goes really well, and if that team member is really demonstrating very strong service and strong guest experience skills, the level of satisfaction from the guest very much carries through the rest of their experience. And then you end up seeing in many other sections within the mystery shop, within the criteria, that the scores are elevated compared to if there was a hiccup at the point of arrival or with maybe that first team member. Well, now that trash can's overflowing. That soap dispenser in the bathroom is out. There's, paper towel on the floor. The team members aren't very friendly. The lines weren't moving as well. All things that could have happened, that could have been exactly the same, identical with that other visit who had that positive first impression. So even though it is kind of a cliche of saying, first impressions are important, you never get a second chance to do it, the guest is going to start thinking, well, what else is wrong with this place? And they're going to tune their eyes differently towards that.
We've seen that challenge, and we've experienced it ourselves, and sometimes it's outside your control. It could, as I say, I've mentioned it already, it could be down to weather, especially with our European UK audience. That's something that can be an absolute challenge, and it's what procedures, what tools have you got, and what planning. We know weather's going to be a challenge. We know the Orlando market. We're especially in the season where it's going to rain every afternoon for about an hour, and you can almost set your clock by it. So what impact does that make? What can we do? And what have we seen, I guess, in the industry to help recover that? What are they doing in terms of, it is a first impression because it's the first time that I'm experiencing this park, and what's their procedure? A bit like Magic Kingdom having their rainy day parade. I think that's fantastic. I've been there and actually timed it deliberately to make sure I'm there to see a rainy day parade as opposed to the standard 3 o'clock parade, because it's novel, it's different. They've catered for that first impression.
Yeah. I think that ties into saying like we've got a plan in place, and I think that service recovery ties in really nicely with that as well. There was a client I was working with last year. It was an observation deck at the top of a skyscraper, and you come in through the ground floor, and that's where the admissions is, and also obviously where the queue then to get into the elevator to go up to the top. And they brought up this circumstance with a guest who bought their admission online and misunderstood or misinterpreted the verbiage on the website. And it was like, buy online and skip the line on arrival. Because if you buy your tickets in advance, you don't need to wait in line at admissions. You simply go to the venue. And so they got there and they asked the team member, where do I go to skip the line? And the team member said, well, what do you mean? Like, this is the queue to get in. They said, no, I bought online. So I skipped the line. I said, no, you skipped that line over there pointing to admissions, which didn't have a line. And the line to actually get into the elevator was about 20 minutes. And they said to me, like, well, what should we do in that circumstance? The guest, this is I call it a self-imposed service failure, because the guest misunderstood what they were buying. They thought they were buying kind of an elevated VIP experience. And I said, well, think about this. I said, do you have to recover? No, because you didn't do anything wrong. But now that guest is going to stand in line for about 20 minutes. They're going to gripe and grumble, and they might impact the experience of the people around them of now they're kind of frustrated. And then all those things that I mentioned earlier, of that trash can overflowing, that soap dispenser's out, that team member's not very friendly, the view from the top isn't that great, whatever it is. Now they're going to be thinking about all those things. And I said, well, what if you recovered? So what's the worst that could happen? There's a group of 2 or a group of 3 or so that now has a very minor impact to the rest of the line that's almost insignificant. Well, now you explain to the guest, you say, you know what? I completely understand how you could have read the website that way. That line over there is the one that you were able to bypass. This line right now is about 20 minutes. However, since you came up and you spoke to me, what I'm going to do is just this one time, I'm going to get you up to the front to get into the elevator. Well, now they're kind of walking on air, right? Now they're on cloud 9, no pun intended, right? They get up to the top and now they're much more refreshed. And now all those things, that overflowing trash can, that soap dispenser, whatever it is, might be exactly the same. And they're not thinking about it as much because of that recovery moment. Ties in with the peak end rule to be able to manage their expectation, changed the first impression. That is the second chance at the first impression. When you correctly recover from it, now becomes a more compelling part of the experience.
And that's a perfect example of where that recovery as such didn't really have any financial impact. It's technically moved everyone else in the line back. Maybe, there's 2 people technically that then didn't get in the elevator that would have had to wait for 1 more, but that probably didn't make much difference to the experience for them.
Exactly.
And that's now made a talking point. That's made such a recovery for someone to be, I guess it's a memorable experience again.
It is. And, consider the cost of not doing it versus the cost of just erring on the side of the guest and defaulting to saying, hey, we want to recover. Think of how the guest is going to process it afterwards. And if they were to post a negative review, that can then turn away other people. 1 negative review can turn away up to 30 prospective guests. Multiply that by your per cap and by your party size. Multiply that by 12. That's the cost of 1 negative review a month, over the cost of over the course of a year.
And I touched on it earlier again with airport travel. One of the biggest bugbears is going through security. It's a challenge at various times of the day. It can be very, very busy. And I've seen, from my own experience, where I've gone into airports, and it's, especially if it's an airport that I don't travel through very often, I've seen it where it's ultimately controlled chaos, where people are queuing everywhere, you don't know. And for me, I want to be as efficient as possible. I know there's been films about this where almost I look for which is going to be the quickest line, etc. Yeah. And that's where I kind of want to game the system. One of the really simple things, and it's one of the rules, and again, I promise I'm not on commission, but I know I've seen it at Atlanta Airport because I'm up there at least once a month. In the mornings, they know they get slammed because TSA has a maximum throughput. They cannot speed it up, they cannot quick it because ultimately security has to take priority. But there's a rule where if there's a line sitting in the atrium, they will literally get their front of line staff from guest services to senior leaders to be putting on high-vis jackets and getting down there and actually being a face and owning it, not just letting this chaos happen, and explain to people, look, it may look like a longer line, but I can promise you that round the corner, that line's an even longer line. You're actually in the best place, or flip side. And they actually deliberately do human people diversions, again, to help improve that first impression, because the majority of people now that don't check in bags, that go straight through, that's their first impression, walking into the airport, being dropped off. And it's shown that they care. Those members of staff appreciate it takes them away from their normal day job, but it's a fantastic use case for where they're actually, redeploying those skills.
And even if that doesn't actually make the line faster for the passenger, it still elevates satisfaction because they have more of an understanding of how long the queue is and seeing that there are actual people who are moving the line along rather than kind of just slugging through it, especially if you're running late.
Yeah, and again, we're not going to diversify into it, but look at how the evolution of lines. There's obviously fast tracking queue line systems out there globally, but then you look at major new attractions where they've actually incorporated the line as part of the experience.
Right.
And actually, there's been times where I've had a fast pass and skipped through the normal line, and then on a quieter day, I've actually gone through the deliberate line because it's part of the pre-story, it's part of the show.
Right.
So it's interesting how, but we're not going to go down that rabbit, Warren.
Yeah.
Just to reiterate to the audience, because we're coming up on around about half time. If there are any questions or comments, we are amazingly, to Josh and my credit, we are running to time, which is very unusual.
Wow.
So if there are any questions that have up, then feel free to jot them down, and we will address them as we pass through into the last couple of slides.
Cool. And hi, Monica.
I don't quite know how the comments are working because some of them are popping up as bubbles, and I think some of them are running on a separate chat.
I'm only looking at the ones that are popping up. Yeah.
I like it. So I wanted to touch a little bit more on demographics, Josh. And what I mean by this, and obviously everyone knows what the word demographic means, but how impactful, and from what have we seen, and again, we're trying to use as relevant data as possible. So we looked at all of last year's data, primarily for the UK, and also then comparing that to the US audience, to pull up some stats on who's the most vocal. And when we say the most vocal, this is the most likely to leave feedback from various mechanisms. So this isn't just on-site, this is also post-visit surveys. And of those vocal group, which we can see is the 35 to 44-year-olds, with about a fifth of the feedback being left, about a quarter of them actually had children with them. And I know my experience is going to an attraction as a group of adults versus going with a family and going with my nieces. It's a completely different experience in respects of almost that value for money, that, ultimately leading back to that guest feedback piece and, what's perceived as a good experience. And sort of who's got the buying power, etc. in there. So I didn't know if you want to speak a little bit more of sort of the impact the targeting to different ages has.
Yeah, I think, there's nothing I think that is really surprising about this. I think that this all probably aligns with probably what I would have guessed. And then I think if we really kind of extrapolate, what does this really mean? They're the ones who are most likely to leave feedback. So that doesn't necessarily mean that this is not the demographic of the makeup of your attendance. It's the ones who really are very mindful of their perceptions of their experience. And for a quarter of them, experience for their family with their young children. And likely it means that they could be the decision maker for the family. So this could be a full circle moment of they're the ones who've done the research, they bought the tickets, they packed the suitcases, right? They packed the coolers and the snacks and all that. And now kind of closing the loop of here is how my experience went. And so I think that if we look at it really through that lens, now we can say, okay, who are we really talking to when we're thinking about our messaging, thinking about our post-visit communication, or even our pre-visit communication, because this ties in with managing expectations. Well, whose expectations are we managing? Well, the people who are gonna tap the survey at the end, or the people who are gonna provide feedback after their visit, who have an influence over where their discretionary dollar is going to go. So I think it's really like you take all the data on this and then really zoom out to 30,000 feet. What other points in the guest journey do we need to make sure that we're mindful of this demographic when we're controlling that messaging?
And I think that's something that, regardless of, however you're collecting your feedback, and this isn't a self-promotion advert for Avius, whatever methodology you're using, is making sure you're using the tools that are there. And it can be as simple as an Excel pivot table and being able to see, obviously you can see the breakdown of your different ages, but then how's that impacting value for money? I know back in the day, we had an example where we were looking at theme parks, and actually I think it was the 55 and over age bracket, were having a fantastic value for money, but their satisfaction with NPS was significantly lower. And it was purely because there was nothing for them perceived to be able to do, because they didn't want to be going on the high intensity roller coasters. And all they simply did was they introduced some quiet spots and some chill out areas, because that was the feedback they got from that demographic. And it was catering. So it didn't cost a lot of investment to be able to listen to that, but it's making sure we're adapting to this. And I'm sure it goes into all theme park planning for new parks, but the majority of people aren't opening new parks and new FECs. So what's important for, a trampoline park that's going to open, it's obviously, we know where their core demographic it is, but you're still going to be getting, the grandparents that take their kids and what's important to them, what's going to be perceived value for money, and sort of to help, I guess, just be aware of the fact that not every guest that walks in the door is obviously identical. You can't make too many prejudgments, but absolutely there's a huge impact based on what people are expecting to be a good experience.
Yeah, you need to understand who the core demographic is, but then who they're bringing with them, and making sure that you can provide that full rounded experience to not just everyone who's leaving feedback, but really the entire party as well. And you talk about just kind of creating areas that are more comfortable, or adding more benches or things like that. There's so many different avenues you could be thinking about as well. This could tie into saying, wait, we need to create a new admissions package that's geared towards families with children under the age of 6, because here are the ones who are most vocal, therefore it might resonate the most with them as well. So really kind of picking it apart and saying, okay, it helps understand not just the demographic of the guest, but the demographic of the most vocal member of that party.
Yeah, and piggybacking on that, I remember, I don't know if the theme park still does it, and it escapes me, I'll have to find out which one it was, but they went for a season or two where they deliberately did their pricing admission policy based on height. Because the theory was, the taller you were, the more percentage of the attractions in their park that you could go on. And I was like, that's a brilliant concept, but typically when it got to grandparents, they were qualifying at the most adult, tallest height, but they were being able to actually utilize it the least. But it's interesting. I like people to just change things and mix things up, and don't be afraid to test things.
Yeah.
I know Merlin back in the day, when there was challenges around our taxation system in the UK, they did all of their prices for a season without tax. And they advertise it as, this is your price. Oh, and by the way, this is the clunk that the government's going to stick on top, which was an interesting perception. They've now reverted back to the old way of displaying prices, but it was interesting to see how they were adapting to it. So the only other piece I've got on demographics that is something that's more anecdotal, that I've got, but the stats definitely back it up, is how, and this may not be applicable to all of our audience, but how different nationalities will rate their experiences. And again, back true with our airport guests that are coming in, and obviously international guests are being, they don't really have a choice. They have to go to the airport. But what we've seen, and this was a study we did specifically around food and beverage, was how an American guest will go into a theme park and they can have a quote unquote good to excellent dining experience, and they will still give that a maximum 5 out of 5 or a 10 out of 10, based on the experience that they had, because they're back to their expectation setting. They know they're not going into a Michelin star restaurant. So if I go into a pizza restaurant and actually it is exceptional pizza for a theme park and back to my expectations, they'll give it that full score. Whereas what we've seen is typically your European audience will be very, very unlikely to give you that maximum score, because for them, a 5-star is that Michelin star silver spoon. That's what a 5-star is. If I come into a theme park and I'm still rating it 4 out of 10 for 4 out of 5 for a European guest, that absolutely could mean they've had the best theme park meal ever, but they're never going to go above that. And then the flip side on that, from what we've seen with our data, if you're looking further east to the APAC region, then they're typically coming in and their satisfaction, their expectation of what their day is going to be like is already sitting at 100%. And that's why they start their day at 100%. And almost you've got to take away from that and upset them a little bit to get them off that higher score. So the theory and what I'm trying to get to is you could almost have a copy and paste exactly the same operation with literally robots, exactly the same in all 3 regions. And the scores, even with exactly the same environmentals, would never line up identical. So that's back to where our clients very much rely on trending data, not necessarily just hitting thresholds. It's very much how are we compared to this time last week, compared to this time last month, etc. But I just thought that was a really interesting little snippet of how demographics can make an impact, because an airport can't control where the guests are coming from, but it's how they deliver that experience. Yeah,
and I think and you got to take for granted or keep in mind, I should say, of when you're asking guests to rate something on a numeric score, that's based on their interpretation of what that number actually means. NPS from 0 to 10. 7 to me might be an 8 to you, and vice versa. And then same thing with 1 to 5. Like you said, 4, that could be technically the top score for that, for that guest. And they say, well, this is the greatest experience I've ever had. It's a 4 out of 5, right? And so we need to take that into consideration. There's a tweet that I'll bring up that I pull this from time to time when talking about this of it's a Google review of somebody. There's not much context around this, which actually makes it even funnier. It says, Dr. Lewis saved my life, 4 out of 5 stars, and then he retweeted it and said, still trying to earn that 5th star. And it's like, well, that was. She must have been a European patient.
I like that. And I've seen it where people have almost done the opposite as well, where, they've had the 1-star review, worst coffee ever, and they make a joke of it. And they're literally like, come and experience the worst coffee ever.
That's making lemonade, right? Out of lemons there. Take your bad reviews and use them to amplify your marketing. So, yeah.
Exactly. No, that's very, very true. So let's glide on over to our last slide, which deliberately is our smallest looking slide visually. But this is going to be very much focusing and talking all around incentives. So this is something that Josh and I have got a fair chunk of experience on. I'm just going to wait for the slide to catch up, or I'll advance it on myself. But the synopsis behind it is whether to incentivize a survey or not. And I was out with a major attraction yesterday, and the question came up of, how do people go up? Why would people, in our case, go and complete an on-site survey? And similar with a post-visit survey. I know I've said this many times before, but when I travel on any airline, as I'm sure everyone else does here, I get sent that email the next day, tell us what you thought. And as a CEO of a feedback management company, I won't fill out that survey online personally, because I'm doing that same route every single month, unless I've had an exceptionally good or an exceptionally bad experience. So we often get asked this question around sort of the core to incentivification, if that's a word, and whether that's, and how that can skew data. Before I hand over the microphone to Josh, ultimately from what we've seen from our experience after collecting literally millions of surveys, there's a huge difference between this guaranteed incentive and giving a prize draw based on what type of data you're trying to collect. So to put that into a real world example, if I'm going to be doing a prize draw, so complete our survey and we're going to enter you into the prize to win an annual pass, that from our experience will skew people's opinion. So if I was going to go and give you that 7 out of 10, if I can see that there's a prize that I can win, consciously or subconsciously, I'm going to be increasing that 7 to a higher scale, because psychologically, I think I've got more chance of winning that. Whereas if there's a guaranteed incentive, and this can then tie back into secondary spend, be it if you fill out our survey, we're going to text you or email you a $5 off, a $25 spend in our duty-free shop, in our gift shop. Giving them that guaranteed incentive will not skew that data and won't spin their opinions, because their opinions are their opinions, and they're going to be getting that reward guaranteed anyway. So before I come on to the KPI, non-KPI piece, I didn't know if Josh, you had any sort of personal experience from both sides, being behind the bar and being the customer. Around that incentivizing.
Like cracks knuckles here. Let me, I'm trying to.
I'll get comfy.
Yeah, exactly. I was even talking to a client about this yesterday, and I don't know how much people are still really relying on TripAdvisor for online reviews. I know it's really been declining in a few years, or over the last few years, in terms of being a review site. It seems to be more of an online travel agency. But I recall reading through kind of their terms. This was a little like 10, 11 years or so ago, that said, if there is a suspicion that you are manipulating your reviews, and you're going to get a red badge that is going to notify potential travelers, potential visitors, that the reviews might not be authentic. And that's one of the biggest things really to think about, of saying, yes, you want more 5-star reviews. Yes, you want more reviews on Google. That's very good for your SEO. That can lead directly to more bookings. And let's make sure we do it the right way. And let's make sure that these reviews are truly reflective of the experience. So I think, you and I were chatting about this. My dentist's office used to have this, chalkboard right in front that says, leave us a 5-star review on Google, show us the review, and get like 50% off at teeth cleaning. I haven't seen that there in a few years, which is good. But that directly says, it's kind of we will give you this in exchange for the thing that we need, regardless of how your experience actually was. So as someone who's very service and hospitality driven, I want to see reviews that are truly reflective of the experience that people are having. There are a couple things related to incentives with feedback or with surveys in particular. One of them is incentivizing your guests. The other is incentivizing your staff. And this is something that a lot of people do as well and can be very effective. Unless the staff is directly soliciting the review from the guest without actually delivering an experience from it. There's a story that I tell often of I pulled up to a valet at a hotel, and a really nice hotel that I was working with from a consulting standpoint. And the valet attendant came up, gave me the card to retrieve my car later, told me the instructions on how to get it back, and then followed up with a business card with the TripAdvisor logo that said, "And I would love it if you posted a 5-star review about me." And I looked at him and I said, "About what?" "About how you told me how I can get my car back." So I pull up review sites all the time or reviews all the time on Google, and I'll see like, Ben is great, Josh is fantastic, give Stacy a raise, Michaela is phenomenal. And it's like, not only is it so obvious that the team members are just soliciting reviews from the guest, but that also doesn't help any guest actually plan their visit. However, when you ask guests to review their experience, and if they said, "I came to Avius Land and Ben greeted me at the front and he saw that I was a first-time visitor and I had never been there before, and he pulled out the map and he gave out the whole lay of the land and whatever. Ben was phenomenal, and because of Ben, I had an amazing experience with my family." Okay, that's a review about the experience. That's worth giving Ben the incentive that you're giving to your staff. Back over to the guest side, the way that I think is the most effective way to do it, because yes, the incentive for the guest is going to increase the response rate that you're getting. Make it a guarantee, like you said, not the prize draw, which, by the way, that is really interesting what you said about that of I just think I'm going to get, my entry is going to be weighted, correlated with the rating that I give, essentially.
I think the hypothesis is if I rate it negatively, they're never going to pick me to come back. Why would they?
Right. Yeah. So that in and of itself is really interesting. But then the incentive of being guaranteed is in response for providing your feedback. So I like to say, let's collect feedback internally first, because we actually do want complaints. We actually do want the friction points. In exchange for your feedback, we will provide you X. And then in the survey, divide out your promoters from detractors. Ask your promoters at the end of that survey to leave a review and give them the path to be able to do that. The incentive is blanket. It doesn't matter if they leave a review or not. They get it for providing the feedback to you. I know it might chip away at your volume of reviews, but it helps control the flow and make sure that you're only asking your most satisfied guests for your reviews, because you're diverting your detractors through your service recovery channels, which guess what you're going to do after? Ask them for a review after you've achieved the recovery paradox. And those are going to be an even more compelling review than those who said, "Yeah, I had a great experience. This was fun. You should go." And then the incentive is baked into it for providing the feedback internally, taking that internal survey. And now we're asking our most satisfied guests to leave a review. Does that align with, like I'm curious for your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And that's where I've seen, and there was a session on it. Josh and I were both at the Florida Attractions Association last week, and there was a breakout session around, various topics, but one was around the validity of online reviews. And one of the attractions said, I'm a small team. Should I be replying to every review? Now, the exact answer is ideally yes, if you can, but you've got to make sure that it's not just scripted, it's not just canned. But so example, I'm going to Buffalo next weekend for a mystery weekend. I've never been before. It's going to be a bit of fun. Go for a long weekend. And for me, it's I will still look at Google review and look for restaurants, etc. But if I click on a restaurant, if all the reviews are, everything's absolutely positive, and you can tell it's not authentic, and we all know there's technology out there where you can buy reviews. But also, I love to hear the responses, and I don't mind seeing a negative review. If there's a negative review but the operator has actually resolved it and dealt with it, then almost that builds a bit more validity, in my opinion. to it. But yeah, for me, in terms of the incentive piece, I can proudly say that I very rarely do online surveys, if ever at all. Equally, I love to give positive feedback. So, coming out of a park the other day, I had an amazing, we had a operationally challenging day. We'd been to the restaurant and absolutely turned our experience. The maitre d' was absolutely fantastic. The server was amazing. And I wanted to make sure that there was a cast recognition for that. And I made sure I made the effort to actually go and do that. Now, had they sent me, and sure enough, they sent me their traditional next day email survey, I wasn't going to go and commit 10 minutes of my life filling out a whole long survey just to name check them. But I still wanted that recommendation to come back. Because people's time's getting more and more valuable. It's how people value that time themselves to be able to leave that feedback. But coining back into the incentive piece, we have had a number of clients that we're in talks with now, and it's more in a not necessarily a paid experience. So if you're talking a shopping mall and you just want to capture drive time data, you want to capture pure demographic data, that's something where an incentive, and if you actually throw up a big banner above it, if I'm telling you, Josh, tell me, your family makeup and where you've driven from today to come to this mall, and we're going to give away a $500 Amazon gift card at the end of the month. Well, there's no motivation for you to lie about that feedback. So in that way, incentives can work quite nicely. That's
market research, right? You're not gathering perceptions from that. You're gathering consumer behavior and demographics.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I've just been told there is a long question. We'll come up to that in a moment. So is there anything else? Just I'm aware we're coming up to about the last 7 or 8 minutes here before we have to peace out. I can't actually see the comment myself. I don't know if you've got it in front of you, Josh. It looks like it's from Jamie, our friend over at Tapman. Look at that. There we go. So I've done it in reverse where I've given a lower rating, thinking it might stick out, help odds of winning chance, navigate to lower scores. Sorry, I'm reading this in real time. I'm not making I would be an awful telecaster.
So he's given lower ratings, thinking, okay, the odds of winning are higher because we navigate to lower ratings, or maybe like, this person really needs the prize. We want to be able to earn their high review back.
they've had such a poor experience. No, that's very valid as well. And it's, you've got to look at the. I guess ultimately, if we're going to start rounding things up, the biggest thing for me is I love working with attractions that are not scared to evolve and change. Just because something was right 10 years ago doesn't mean it's necessarily right now. And we've got clients that have got 15, 18 years worth of historic data, which is fantastic, but they're not afraid to dip their toe in the water of trying different methodologies and trying different mechanisms of being able to collect that feedback piece, whatever that looks like, be it on-site or post-visit, etc.
For sure.
I don't know if you can see this comment that's just coming here from Tiki about how AI is influencing the feedback we receive. How can we accurately gauge the sincerity of our guests' experiences when some of the stories they shape appear to be generated by AI? And thanks for putting this together.
What are your thoughts on that?
So I say it's interesting when people are saying AI in terms of what does AI mean to you and me could be a completely different interpretation. I know for my girlfriend, AI is ChatGPT that she fires questions and gets opinions on her phone. For me, AI is what we're doing behind the scenes of how we're looking at results, etc., and how we're making sure that the data is valid. So I wouldn't say combat fire with fire, but you can definitely use some AI tools that are out there to help detect for these sorts of things. But I think this is where you've just got to be a bit aware, and it links into my last point around online reviews and making sure that reviews are valid and they're not just, I'm leaving a review on Magic Kingdom. Well, I went on Peter Pan's and then I went on It's a Small World because they were just name checked on obvious attractions.
It was not.
Yeah, so it's something like anything just to be aware, I think, in my case, of what's out there. It's ever evolving. I know I'm not a subject matter expert. I know there was a few sessions on it last week. Kevin McNulty is certainly an industry expert, to name check him, in terms of he seems to be on the ball with what's going on with trends. And every time I drop him a WhatsApp, there's something new happening that I'm not aware of. But I think it's just don't go in blind and don't necessarily believe everything the guest is telling you straight away without necessarily having a bit of context around it. And don't be scared to challenge it.
Yeah, and when it comes to recovery, you want to validate the guest's concern, you at least want to validate that they were there as well. So I know this isn't related to AI, but I recall working in guest communications before, and a guest called and said that they were visiting the park, and her boyfriend is diabetic and ordered a Diet Coke and was served a regular Coke and immediately had to be rushed to the hospital. And they said, I don't want a refund, I just want tickets to come back. So this kind of ties in with just like the validity of the complaint in general, whether it's AI or it's just somebody just trying to fabricate for free stuff. And I took it very seriously and asked her questions as far as like, okay, tell me everything. What food stand was it? What was the name of the team member? Do you have your receipt? Which park were you at? What part of the park were you at? What day were you here? She wasn't able to answer any of those. And so I took it and was giving the guests the benefit of the doubt, even though with every question I asked, it made it more and more obvious that this was a fabricated complaint to be able to get free tickets. I still offered her a 10% discount. So I said, you come back to the park, I'll give you 10% off of 2 admission tickets to come back, and she disconnected. So in terms of accurately gauging the sincerity of our guests' experiences, is if you can't validate what actually happened, or you can't even validate that your guest visited, but you're still there's still the opportunity to err on the side of recovery, go towards low value, low cost items. I will say this is kind of on the flip side. This is about responses, and I just saw very recently that there is an AI tool. I don't have any more details on this because I just saw this a couple of days ago, that will auto reply to reviews, and it will do it by acknowledging kind of what the guest said. Like it'll acknowledge like the person, like it doesn't just look like copy and paste. Like it will actually create a response that are similar but not identical to one another as you kind of stack them on top of each other. And I have mixed feelings about it. But I think from from the tech standpoint, being able to streamline your guest communications, it can definitely be helpful. And if we're worried about the guest's feedback being sincere, we should also make sure that the guest's response is sincere as well. So I get the benefits of it. I'm on the fence on if I like it or not. The jury's still out for me.
No, I can see that. Well, Josh, we are coming to the end of the hour. Do want to thank you. Hopefully everyone can see scrolling across the bottom. If anyone wants to get hold of Josh, his email address is flying across the bottom with just josh@liebmanleisure.com. I'm available at ben@avius.com, but I think everyone's probably got my contact details by now. But yeah, are there any other sort of closing final moments, Jerry Springer style, Josh?
Feedback is your wellspring towards continuous improvement, and every single guest should have the opportunity to leave feedback. It shouldn't be a one-time event. It shouldn't be seasonal. It should be every single guest with every transaction they have, every visit that they have, to be able to understand their perceptions, to be able to recover from friction points, strengthen your relationship with your guest, drive loyalty, and keep making your guest experience better.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Well, thank you, Josh, for your time in prep and also delivering this. And thank you to the audience that's tuned in both live and obviously post-visit. As always, if there are any questions, if you're watching this on a replay, feel free to reach out directly to Josh or myself. We'll make sure those comments get routed. And Josh, thank you for being on our inaugural Avius webinar. You did me the pleasure of being on Attraction Pros as a single digit with yourself and Matt. So I finally got to repay the favor, and I'm sure Matt's ears are heating up as we'll plan a future webinar. Thank you so much in advance.
We've got some catching up to do. We're at 406 now, so you got some.
That could be a challenge. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for attending too. Hope this was valuable.
Cheers, everyone.